I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Ryan Boyd. He is a computational social and behavioral scientist at Lancaster University, where he researches language and how language can predict personality and behavior. Ryan, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So I'd love to hear a brief overview of your work and how you got interested in it.
Yeah. So where to begin? Thousands of years ago. So I'll start, I guess, with a little bit of, I'll give like an abridged history, I guess, of Ryan Boyd's academic life. So I started out in psychology in undergrad at the time, it was a joint satellite school between IU and Purdue University, and just kind of chose psychology on a lark. It sounded interesting as a major. Took a semester of it and was like, I don't think I like psychology anymore. And then decided I would stick with it for another year or so before switching to something else, and had a couple of really just absolutely fantastic classes. So I took in just like an intro to social psych class. It was taught by Craig Hill, and a developmental psychology class taught by Michelle Druin. And they both kind of introduced me to a really deep and interesting world of psychology that I hadn't seen before. So at some point there, particularly in the social psych space, something clicked, and I thought, this is just something interesting, something about the material, something about the instructor. He's one of these guys, like any question you would ask him, he had just like the most thoughtful answer to. And I was like, I want to be like that guy. I want to be as smart as Dr. Hill is. And so I kind of got this idea of social psychology lodged in my mind is something to pursue. Fast forward a little bit, and I went off to a PhD program at North Dakota State University. It was a social and health psychology PhD. And just kind of by happenstance, one of the first projects that I was involved in when I was there is working with Michael Robinson and one of the students in his lab, who's more senior than me, Adam Fetterman. Adam was really interested in like political psychology. He was a big John Jost fan. And so he had some thoughts on a project about, let's see if we can find some kind of deep psychological differences between liberals and conservatives, or Democrats and Republicans, stuff like that. And so basically one of the first things I was tasked with was going and trying to collect a bunch of language data from wherever. I think we start off with like maybe liberal or like news articles from left-leaning websites and news articles from right-leaning websites. And it was like pretty painful and tedious, scrolling endlessly through like MSNBC and copying and pasting articles and stuff. Mm-hmm. But once we got to a certain point, they were like, okay, we've got this software, Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, Luke. You take the texts, you run them through there, and you'll get a bunch of numbers out that tell you about the psychology of the authors, or of the, each website or something like that. And I ran it a little bit, and I didn't really understand it that well. It was all still very new to me. And most of the work I was doing kind of stayed in really kind of complicated intersection of like cognitive psychology, personality, trying to understand like the cognitive processes that kind of coalesce into personality, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. So this natural language processing stuff was already quite well established by the time you were getting started.
It was kind of in this weird adolescent phase, we'll say. So like the first Luke 2007 was the one at the time. And it had been around for a couple of years already. It was the first version where people started to really say like, oh, this is something we can do. At the time, people have been collecting language data in a lot of different forms for decades. So, if you ran like a mock jury study or something like that, you might like videotape it and, transcribe the conversations or stuff like that. Because doing any kind of coding of the text was a huge pain in the ass, and people just didn't do it for the most part because it was so tedious, with so little payoff. And Luke 2007 is one of these first programs where people start saying like, oh, maybe we can take this and start using it on our data. So there was like this kind of rising tide of like text analytics stuff in psychology, but it hadn't really, this is debatable, but it's certainly then it hadn't reached anywhere near like kind of a mature point yet. Despite the fact that people have been using computers to do this for decades up to that point. There were people doing this, in the 60s and 70s even, but it was all kind of this primordial NLP and psychology stuff that it was right around that time, 2007 to 2012, we'll say, that there was kind of this, things just started to come together, computing power and things like that. So there's like this kernel that existed, and it was completely lost on me at first.
So when you first decided to do a PhD, did you imagine doing either language work or computational work, or had you envisioned doing like more traditional social psych experiments where you're like maybe I don't know, just working with large groups of people?
When I first decided to go to grad school, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had no idea. I knew I wanted to do something in social psychology, but I didn't have any idea what that was really. And that's one of the nice things about working with Michael is he did a lot of research on a lot of different topics. And so in the time that I was working with him there, I got to kind of try out a lot of different stuff. So I was doing stuff with the NLP type of stuff, but not like ultra formally. It was just kind of like, here, check this out. But then also lots and lots and lots of lab studies. And as I started doing more lab studies, we go through this process where we just design these kind of painstakingly careful experiments for the lab. And I remember coding up this one study. It was like a joystick study where essentially there's like a circle bouncing around the screen, and the participant had to chase it with a joystick. And you're trying to like quantify like how they're moving around based on whether the circle's chasing them or they're chasing the circle and so on. And it was just like, I probably got like 5 hours of sleep that whole week, like working on this thing. Got the data back, and it was just like atrocious data. And even with the data that was there, like you could only really quantify it a handful of different ways. If you're being generous, maybe like 10, 15 different measures of like how people are moving their joysticks. Never correlated with anything. And that's when it started to click for me, like, with this language analysis stuff, I can just have someone write for like 5 minutes and I can extract just this whole kind of battery of psychological information. It's almost like giving someone, because at the same time we were also giving a lot of self-report questionnaires. So it's like, I'd look at it, we'd go through this whole process to get like maybe 30 or 40 self-report measures, and then like, a couple of computer-based like performance measures. Or I could just have somebody write for 5 minutes and extract like twice as much data from that information. And so that's when it really started to click for me. Like, I think this language stuff is like something I can do. And when I started to learn more about how Luke worked, I was like, well, hell, I can do that. Like, that seems simple enough. So it started to, I went from like my first encounter with it, just being like, I don't know, this is cool, but I don't really get it, to like, just suddenly I was absolutely absorbed by it, just completely fixated. Which, honestly for me, in retrospect, thinking about like kind of a graduate trajectory, for example, super duper lucky, because I came in not really with any strong, I wasn't like passionate about a certain area or anything like that. And it was just like through happenstance and through kind of gain exposure to a lot of different stuff and working with Michael, the language stuff, it just clicked. I just absolutely latched onto it. And like, this sounds cliche, and I don't want to like make it sound I don't want to like glorify it necessarily, but I was like obsessed, like beyond an unhealthy level of obsession, where like I'd go into the office and work all day, like tinkering and doing, you know, writing code and doing stuff for language analysis. And I'd like go home and like check out just, I would go to like used bookstores and like see if I could just find anything on language analysis and like dig out these like nasty old musty books and just, you know, pay like $1 and just obsess over them. It was just something that clicked with me so deeply, which is one thing that, you know, a lot of people like will say like, oh, it's really important to be passionate about something if you're going to do it in grad school. And I was like, I don't know about that. But then that it definitely made a world of difference. And then, you know, through that and through kind of a long, it's a long and complicated story, so I won't bore you with it, but ended up going down after I got my master's at NDSU, went down and continued on my PhD with working with Jamie Pennebaker at UT Austin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting to hear all this, because reading your bio, I would have assumed that you were a data scientist turned psychologist and not the other way around.
Yeah, and you know, there was an interesting thing I noticed when I was at NDSU. So like when I was a kid, I wanted to be, I basically wanted to like make video games. But we didn't have a computer at home or anything like that. So I'd like go to the library, or like I remember my grandmother bought me like a book at C++. It was like, you know, one of those thick tomes. So I would just like sit there at night after I was supposed to be asleep as like, you know, a fifth grader or something like that, like hide under the blankets with a flashlight and this dense book on C++, just like poring over it and studying it and so on. And then after a certain point, I kind of like moved away from it. I did a bunch of like programming for like, you know, Texas Instrument calculators and things like that, just as a hobby. But by the time I went to college, I kind of dropped all of that. And it was really at NDSU where I started to notice that, where there was stuff that we were doing in the lab that I was like, I know enough about programming, just enough to be dangerous, right? But I wouldn't, you know, the stuff I was doing code-wise was stuff that, like, to be honest, like an undergrad in computer science would have run circles around me. But it was so out of the ordinary in psychology that it really, I think in a lot of ways gave me a huge like that. But I was suddenly able to do things that other people weren't doing. And from there, especially with language analysis, it kind of, they just came together so naturally. Like, you know, working with language data computationally, like the more you want to do new stuff, the more you have to be able to write that into code. And then once you go deeper and deeper down that rabbit hole, it's like, well, hell, the 90% of the internet is text data. And if I want to get that, I can either go back to copying and pasting it and being miserable in an office, or I can just spend a day, write a script to do it for me and let the magic happen that way. So the interests kind of co-evolve together, but not I don't know, maybe there's some deeper connection there. There probably is, but like, yeah. I've never thought about that deeply, to be honest.
Well, it makes a lot of sense, especially hearing that you did have that earlier interest that you sort of reconnected with. So working with James Pennebaker, who I know has done a lot of work with language and personality, I don't know how much of his work was computational, at least maybe before you came around. So is this something new that you brought to the table once you started your PhD?
I'm told that that's the case, yeah. So like, Jamie is, he himself, he knows how to program and stuff like that. Like, I think he's very humble about it. He downplays it, and I don't think he does a lot of active coding himself, but he understands it. And he understands the logic and the structure of how coding works and what kind of can and can't be done with it. Which I think, you know, in many ways has been a huge strength for him. There's this, I'll go on a side tangent real quick, and I promise I'll come back to the question. You know, there's this cliche in kind of in the computer science world, but also in just kind of the software engineering world, where like you want to have a boss who also used to be a software engineer, because they understand when they ask you to do something, like they understand everything that comes with that. If they're like, oh, build this website or have this program do X, Y, and Z, like they actually understand what they're asking you to do. Whereas if you get somebody who comes in with no experience whatsoever, they'll just make these kind of outrageous requests because they don't understand just the sheer amount of like work underneath what they're asking you to do. And I think that Jamie's very much the same way, where he's got enough sense of how that stuff works. Now, when I showed up to his lab, there were people there that were doing stuff that was still quite sophisticated. So Cindy Chung, I think, was maybe a postdoc in his lab at the time, and she was doing some kind of she was doing a bit of like part of speech tagging and a bit of topic modeling, but in a very kind of manual way. It's how a psychologist would do it, not like how a computer scientist would do it. And so that is one thing. I was already kind of on a roll, like cranking out software to do a lot of these tasks already. So, you know, and Jamie has said several times, like when I got to the lab, everyone there was a Mac person except me. And not for any particular reasons, just like what I'd always used and was comfortable with. And I was just pumping out a bunch of software that would only work on PC because of the languages I was writing it in. And within a few years, everyone else in the lab was using PC as well. So, you know, I think I brought kind of a computational sensibility to the lab, so to speak. But also, you know, part of it was just like putting together and like giving these tools out to everyone I could so that they could also do more computational stuff as well. I don't know.
Yeah, so to jump from the more methodological aspect to the actual findings, what were you looking at, and what did the increased computational power allow you to do that hadn't been done before?
It's a good question. So the first one is actually harder to answer. So I was looking at a whole bunch of stuff. So this has always been really from the get-go one of the things I've loved about language analysis. I often describe it to people that things like NLP for me are very much, I refer to it kind of as a magic telescope, which is not a great metaphor, but the idea being that like anything that it kind of catches my interest or that I'm curious about, I can just go look at it through the lens of language and get some answers about it. So, you know, this has allowed me to just kind of look at a whole broad range of topics, a lot of political psychology stuff, values, self-schemas, culture, cognition, kind of storytelling, just all these different kind of disconnected areas of psychology, or, you know, disconnected, so to speak. It's all connected. So, you know, early on, the stuff that I was looking at, I was really interested in kind of language for language's sake, so to speak, and how like really particular kind of linguistic-y types of things would just relate to, we'll say, like everyday behaviors. So like, you know, there's and actually this is what I'd done for my master's thesis, which was not a it wasn't a good thesis, so like don't dig it up and read it unless you really need to fall asleep. But there's like a kind of vaguely linguistic theory called English prime. I won't go into details on it, but basically it's kind of a rule set that you impose on yourself when you're using the English language. It's supposed to try to kind of allow you to be more flexible in your thinking and stuff like that. And so I was looking at stuff like, well, do people who just kind of naturally use more of these violations, do they engage in behaviors that suggest greater cognitive rigidity, for example? So if you're using a lot of these English prime violations, do you see people in kind of more of a fixed way or a flexible way? Do you see the world as more dynamic or static and stuff like that? Interesting theory. I never found much with it, but I was approaching a lot of stuff like that. So kind of an individual differences mindset, but this kind of very low level type of stuff rather than kind of the directions I kind of went into later, which were more these kind of broader personality constructs, we'll say. So, like the big five and stuff like that.
It sounds related to, especially to openness, what you were just describing.
Totally,
Rigidity,
totally.
flexibility.
Yeah, and that's where, like, in kind of a funny circular way, because when I was at NDSU doing all this personality process stuff, where it's like, some of my earlier publications are like this, where like, one of them was we revived this old paradigm from really like the 1950s, where like you put some headphones on a person and you play a sound in one ear or the other, and then you have him make a judgment about something like, a dot on the screen or something like that. And there's this stuff where basically the general finding, we found the same thing as well, is like when you play a sound in one ear, it tends to bias how you perceive things. So like it'll bias it a little bit in one direction or the other based on which ear. It's like the super, I don't know, maybe this is actually more interesting to you than it is to me. But like to me, I was like, this is like, it's interesting, but it's like such boring. It's like a dry finding to play around with. But we're basically like looking at that particular like low level cognitive process and trying to see, do people who are more susceptible to this, are they more kind of egocentric? Do they impose that same cognitive process on the world around them? And at the time, that was super duper like a boring way to approach the world. But now I'm basically doing like the exact same thing with language analysis. And I think it's like the most exciting thing in the world. So I couldn't even tell you why one of them is so interesting to me and the other one isn't. But yeah, and so like a lot of it is this kind of like these low level, we'll say like facets of personality. So like kind of openness and stuff like that, which is also kind of morphed into looking at things like the social behaviors, or like how you can quantify a social behavior through how language unfolds over time and stuff like that.
Yeah, for language, it definitely sounds more interesting being able to look at things like behavior and personality rather than like grammar and phonemes and all these things that kind of went over my head when learning about some of them.
Yeah, totally. And this is one of the interesting things about doing this type of stuff in psychology, is there's like kind of nested between different disciplines. Like linguistics to me is like such a dry discipline, and that's like not to knock the field at all. I get it. I get why people are like into it and fascinated by it, but like to learn about the like those low level features, it's torturous. It's absolutely torturous to sit through like a lecture on phonemes. And similarly, there's a lot of people in psychology who like look at language from a completely, so like psycholinguistics, which is much more about kind of the generation and processing of language. So it's also very cognitive and often very neurological as well. And even to me, that is like, there's interesting research there, but I could never do that type of stuff. Like I'm purely, for whatever reason, it comes back to this like this somewhere deep down nested interest in like the social psychology, like to the point where these days, often the way I describe it is not like language analysis or NLP, but the study of verbal behavior specifically. So it's like, what does this kind of behavior that you engage in generating and putting your thoughts out into the world, what does that tell us about what's going on behind the curtain? Whether it's kind of you posting something on social media, or you like interacting with a friend, whatever you're doing to generate language, I want to be there and analyze that.
Yeah. So you mentioned how all over the place your interests are, but what are some of your favorite findings of the last? Well, I guess we could start with your PhD. We can boil it down to one if that's possible.
Oh man, if I can boil it down to one, I'm trying to think. So many good ones. I'm trying to remember what all was in my PhD. I know it was three. It was like one of those like kind of 3 paper packages. The one in the PhD that I remember the best was probably, actually I think there were 2 studies that were looking at basically like old timey playwrights, which is so like there was one we did. It was basically an authorship attribution study on a play that was, hypothesized to be written by Shakespeare. It was one of these things where we were approached by an actual like Shakespeare scholar. I believe it was Robert Folkenflik was the guy who approached us. He basically gave us the scoop and said, "There's this play. It was allegedly, this guy says he discovered it. He says it's an old Shakespeare play. Could you analyze it and like tell us whether it's Shakespeare?" And my initial reaction was like, "Give me a break. Like, I'm not a Shakespeare scholar." But I was like, I'm pretty sure if people are claiming to find Shakespeare plays, they're probably liars, and like, I don't buy that one bit. And so, I'm happy to like. So the guy's name was Louis Theobald, who say discovered the plays, and there's like a really interesting, rich history between him and kind of Shakespeare and all this other stuff as well. But we ended up kind of doing this thing where we were blending several different areas together. So there was the authorship attribution aspect of it, which is, okay, we have this play and we want to just approach it without any knowledge of who wrote it. And it could have been written by Louis Theobald, Shakespeare, or potentially this other guy who's one of Shakespeare's friends, John Fletcher. And so, there's kind of this classic authorship attribution thing where it's like, okay, let's look at the language of this play called Double Falsehood and just see, is it most similar to Shakespeare or Theobald or Fletcher? But there were other kind of interesting layers on top of that. So we approached it from a very psychological approach. So more to the sense of, not like, does this play use the word as at the same rate as Shakespeare? Like, what is the psychology of the author who wrote this play, whoever it is? How does this psychological profile match the psychological profile of Shakespeare, of Fletcher, of Theobald? And actually, as it turned out, I think it was maybe the first 3 acts maybe the first like 60% of the play turned out to look an awful lot like Shakespeare, like overwhelmingly like Shakespeare. And then most of the rest of it looked like it was his friend John Fletcher with just kind of little bits and pieces of Louis Theobald getting in there and probably making some edits, which is ironically exactly what Louis Theobald said he did, but I don't think anyone believed him at the time. And so that was a really fun project just for a lot of reasons. One of them was it was just like, it felt so like, I am on paper in a lot of ways by design, like a very traditional psychologist, like undergrad, grad programs, all psychology through and through. I took like damn near every psychology class on the books in undergrad. And so like to be working on something that was like Shakespeare, it's like, this feels like something a college professor would do, like what my stereotypes of like what's academia all about. So it was a lot of fun there, but it was also like, okay, we've got kind of literary history with psychology, with machine learning. It was just like really cool intersection of 3 areas. So much fun.
Mm-hmm.
And like, just as like a little side note, one thing that I found really interesting about that whole process was after that paper came out, there was like, I learned how political the Shakespeare world is. Like I had a Shakespeare scholar reach out to me and like tell me like, you have to be careful like who you piss off when you're publishing about Shakespeare, because they'll like come after you. Like I felt like I was gonna get like beat up in a dark alley by a bunch of guys wearing frocks or something like that, which added to the fun of the whole thing. But that's our, and then I ended up in England, so kind of belly of the beast. So
yeah. So did these Shakespeare scholars, did most of them agree with your findings?
It was most, I don't know. A lot of them did. So it's like, this is it, we didn't go in despite what the press said. A lot of the press did the usual like, oh, scholars discover new Shakespeare play. But
I do feel like I've heard of it, so it must have made news, right?
Yeah, it got pretty good press coverage when it came out. And of course, the truth is like, we didn't like, it's not like Jamie and I were like rummaging through a basement and happened to across an old folio. Like other scholars did years of footwork and came up with this theory or these hypotheses already. We came in and tested them. And so a lot of scholars, there seemed to already be a split in the field. A lot of people were already like, yeah, we believe for sure this is Shakespeare's play. And they had a lot of scholarship behind that. And then a lot of other people just outright rejected the idea for a lot of different reasons. I don't feel like we won too many people over, but it was kind of the classic confirmation bias for the people who already believed it. They're like, I knew it. I knew that was Shakespeare all along. And the other ones kind of had a surprisingly negative reaction to it. There are a lot of people who said like, oh, well, you can't just come in here with your computers and do Shakespeare research and yada, yada, yada. And my reaction to that was often like, well, we did. So, it goes. I do know that there were several people who were on the fence who I would get emails from who said like, oh, I don't know how they necessarily felt about it, but they enjoyed it at the very least.
Mm-hmm. So how much of this technology is ready to be applied to anything? You could compare any two works, and how much of it requires fine tuning on your end?
That's a good question. So a lot of this type of stuff, there aren't, to my knowledge, any great kind of super duper, what's the word I'm looking for? Super accessible or simple things. So all of these things require, at least right now, some kind of bolting together of different things. So bolting together which types of language analyses you want to do, which types of machine learning algorithms you want to use, and so on. The fact of the matter is, a lot of this stuff, if you have those basic components, you can stick them together and do it right out of the box without tons and tons and tons of fine tuning. There's some stuff that's kind of general rules of thumb. So for a lot of authorship attribution stuff, especially kind of language analytic things, classification, support vector machines are, for example, one machine learning algorithm. And you can use different types of kernels within a support vector machine, like a linear kernel, for example. And so there's certain things like that that other scholars have found, through lots of rigorous work, that certain types of algorithms or certain types of kernels tend to just be optimal for different types of tasks. And so some of that is you can fine tune it, or you can just kind of by default say look, we know that these work very well in this context. So it's kind of a 50-50 domain expertise and just using what's already out there. And in my experience, for a lot of that type of stuff, especially authorship attribution, usually the limitation is not the tools so much as it is just the data that you can actually get access to, and the quality and the quantity of it. I have no idea if that actually answered your question.
Yeah, I think so. So how do you check for errors in these findings, or what do you use as the standard to hold them up against? I remember hearing about how early visual recognition AI, for example, you could show it a bunch of yellow and black lines and it would say this is a school bus, and it'll be 98% confidence, and then obviously it's not a school bus. And it's gotten better over time, but do you see the same type of thing with language?
So that's an interesting question. So it depends. It depends on kind of the paradigm that you're using. The deeper you go into it, the more complex it can get. So I'm probably going to butcher this finding. So take this with a grain of salt and definitely dig back to the original paper. But there's a bunch of stuff. One of my favorite researchers is Andy Schwartz at Stony Brook University. And he's a computer scientist, does lots of really great stuff, which is doing, so if I'm 66% psychology, 33% NLP, I would say he's the flip side of that. Computer scientist with just really strong sensibilities for psychology. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but I'll spare that. Anyways, they've done some work and so they've done a lot of stuff on predicting age, predicting gender, predicting personality from social media language specifically, but other types as well. And, you know, often they find that, like, yeah, you can predict like somebody's age and gender pretty well from their language, but you can often do as well, if not better, just like by skipping language altogether in your model and just putting in something like, you know, how many likes or how many followers people have, and some of those kind of the social network properties of someone on social media. And, you know, a lot of what they, like, they're very careful to make sure that they're like accounting for all of this, because it's really easy to just like, you know, age and gender are the classic ones where, like, if you're trying to predict something like, I'm trying to think, you know, openness to experience, for example, or conscientiousness, there are age and gender differences in there. And so if you just kind of jump in blindly and use, you know, the language data without digging in and looking really under the hood of this type of stuff, your models are often confounded. So you may be able to predict, you know, something like conscientiousness pretty well. You can probably do a pretty good job estimating that. But if you haven't controlled for things like age and gender, you may just be picking up on linguistic cues that are associated with age or gender. They're inflating this. So there's kind of a couple of bits. There's like the machine learning aspect of it, kind of the best practices for modeling and making sure you're using all the controls that you need to be using, or at least making sure that they're not a non-issue in the data that you have. But then there's also just the plain question of actually just sitting down and reading the language data itself, which is one thing, you know, as language analysis has gotten, it's really kind of exploded in the past few years. And there have been more and more tools that make it easier and easier to do it. And so there's this bit of a gold rush of people doing language analysis research. But a lot of them, you know, don't have a strong sense of like the best practices for doing this. And one of them being, you need to actually just sit down and read the data that you're analyzing. Not necessarily all of it. So if you're processing like, you know, 5 million Ask Reddit posts or something like that, you're not going to sit there and read every single one, but randomly subsample 1,000 of them and sit there and really read them and think about them. Because some of it is just a data integrity issue. So, you know, oh man, I didn't realize that there are like extensive quotes in French in this text or something like that, that maybe you wouldn't have noticed if you just pulled it down from like a big database. But alternatively, there's also going to be stuff in there, and this is something that we do commonly with topic modeling. So if we're trying to kind of find out what are the different themes that emerge from a collection of texts, is often you may kind of look at a cluster of words and think like, oh, this is clearly like a family theme, like mother, father, sister, brother, something like that. And then you actually go in, and when you see how people are actually using those words, it can completely, I guess for lack of a better term, like dispel what you thought it was that people were talking about, or how it is that you thought they were using language.
So what you're describing sounds kind of similar to factor analysis.
Yeah, that's exactly right. A lot of topic modeling is conceptually super duper similar to factor. So like for something like machine learning, they'll usually use some like principal components analysis or factor analysis as a data reduction technique. So like you're kind of like in a noisy way compressing down like a bunch of self-report questionnaire items or something like that. You can do the same thing with language, and like meaningful clusters of words will kind of fall out in the same way that like an extroversion factor might fall out.
Right, that's how Big Five was originally created, right? They had like a whole bunch of different personality measures, and then you factor analyze them, and like these 5 results just emerge.
That's right. 5, give or take. It's still like a point of contention. Like, but yeah, in theory. So for the Big Five, it was very much the same idea, where like factor analyses, really like Raymond Cattell was the big guy who got that ball rolling. And you know, I think his primary solution was like 16 factors, but most other people would, you know, there were like tons and tons of papers over the years that were like, oh, here's 5 factors. Someone else maybe found 4, another person found 6, but consistently, most people were finding 5 using kind of the recommended criteria. And as a actually a sidebar there, so there's people have also tried doing kind of similar stuff with language data. So just taking like a bunch of language data and saying, can we squish this down to just 5 factors? And if so, what does that look like? The first author on that work was Vivek Kulkarni, who's now at Twitter, super smart guy. And actually, I think working with Andy Schwartz. And they found very different dimensions, or quite different, we'll say. I'm not sure what the best adjective is. They found different things. I'll let you determine the severity of it than like what a traditional big 5 approach would have found. So even this is something, I'm starting to go on a tangent here. So I'll pull back and hand it back to you.
That's fine. So I'm sure you've heard about the reproducibility crisis in psychology, especially social psychology. I'm wondering if the computational end of things has it been more robust?
That's a good question. The truth is, the people who are doing the computational stuff in the field, trying to think of an even-handed answer to give here. Yes and no is probably what I would say. I think so. My kind of deep down opinion is that psychology is still way behind the curve when it comes to doing computational stuff. So stuff that we take, that other fields take for granted, even doing things like, cross-validation and some of the kind of testing, even like holdout samples, stuff that was like suggested decades ago. Psychology is still not great about doing it.
Compared to what other fields?
Even stuff like biology, some smart people, medicine, geology, and then anything where like computation has kind of been in the game for a minute. Even people were doing cross-validation, business and marketing, even like beat psychology to the punch on that. It's gaining traction in the field, which helps, right? So like the more that people are kind of understanding these methods, even things like bootstrapping or bootstrap aggregation, the better they'll get at this. The people who are doing that, I would guess that their research is much more robust because they're being cautious to not kind of go in and make these big, messy, grand claims based on like, a sample size of 30 and an overfit GLM or something like that. But, there's always exceptions as well. I won't like slander anyone or anything like that, but you can find examples in psychology, just like any other field, of people who are kind of like using some of the computational approaches, but in a kind of hand wavy type of sense. They're not necessarily using them with the intention of doing the most rigorous or best research possible, but they're interested in using them simply because they dazzle the eye and they know that other psychologists don't know enough about it to really kind of make them be rigorous with it, so to speak. My assumption is that's the minority, though.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we should talk about this trend of things becoming more computational over time, because it seems like, I guess like you mentioned, it sort of starts off with, well, I guess with the fields that are literally computer science or most closely related to it, and then over time the more distant fields become more computational. And obviously psychology is an example of that, but even more unexpected things like history, or like looking at Shakespeare, like we were talking about earlier. Now there's computational stuff. So do you think that's inevitable?
That's a good question. Inevitable, I mean, probably. I think that, like, I'm trying to think of a good example and I'm drawing a blank. I think that computers, and especially the accessibility of computational power, so not just like you can get access to a super powerful computer, but like languages like Python, which I know is like 30 years old, but it's become a much stronger language in the past decade or so, which, because it's such an accessible language, people have access to the computing power of the systems they're working on, if that makes sense. like any kind of innovation or tool, as people gain increasing access to new tools and new methods, I think it's generally inevitable that they will take those and apply them to whatever it is that they're working on. So like, computational is such a generic term these days, but there's people in personality psych who are using, they're doing it in the computational sense, but they're using really kind of sophisticated hardware, so like smartphone sensing, so looking at the accelerometers and gyroscopes and kind of all these sensors within our smartphones to understand things about who we are and how we behave and how we think and how we interact with other people and so on. Anytime there's new tools like this, I think people are going to kind of see them through the lens of whatever it is they're working on and think, how can I take that and use it to kind of solve a question I couldn't solve before?
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Maybe we could talk about the ethics of that. So for one thing, there's, well, the smartphones example you just gave is sort of more personal because it's like on your person, but then even social media posts and analyzing people's text, I guess, have there been any ethical discussions had about like whether we should be grabbing these things from online? I'm not accusing you of anything, but
no, it's okay. Oh, what do you mean? This interview is over. Yeah, no, there's been, I feel like the discussion on it kind of waxes and wanes. There's so many angles to it, and I will say up front, like it's going to take people who are far smarter than me to solve some of these ethical questions. So with, for language data, for example, I remember this was probably about a decade ago now. This is back when like Facebook apps were still kind of like new and exciting, and just about anybody could build a Facebook app and just kind of throw it up. And I can't remember if it was a company or maybe a research team had built an app that was using language analysis to try to estimate depression scores. And the kind of press cycle on that was like, oh, this is amazing, this is incredible, you'll be able to, it's kind of in the vein of like mental health and stuff like that. And I remember I encountered a news article that laid out like why it was so problematic. Like, what you're doing is, and the idea behind the app, I think, was like, if someone looks depressed, it'll notify their friend network. And so, to try to kind of foster meaningful social connection and et cetera, et cetera. And this article pointed out, like, you're literally telling people when someone is like at their most vulnerable, or maybe not in their best, like, kind of judgment decision-making mindset. You are potentially putting up a huge red flag and saying this person can be taken advantage of more easily. Or like, if there's people out there with kind of who are looking to take advantage of them, they might be able to use that information. And that, at the time, I was like, man, I never even would have thought of that. And that, I know that the discussion has advanced so much more since then. There's a lot of interesting stuff done by people in a lot of different spaces, looking at things like not just what can we tell about you. It's not just like privacy concerns, but also like kind of what it says about other people. So like there's David Garcia is a super smart guy, does complexity science. And he's done some work and written some really, really smart pieces on something called shadow profiling. So like, let's say you don't have a Facebook account, but everyone that you know does. Based on that, we can figure out exactly what you're like based on kind of all these people around you.
Wow, so no one's safe.
Yeah, no one's safe. And it's like, these are huge ethical issues that, like, there's like, I think, very little black and very little white, and just tons and tons of different shades of gray. I know it's a bit of a cop-out. My intuition is that for a lot of this stuff, the classic kind of cliche is true. Like, a lot of these tools, a lot of these methods and findings can be used for good or for more nefarious purposes. I wish I had a better answer on like how to best navigate this stuff. There's some stuff I think researchers, at least in academic settings, are more sensitive to these things, like since GDPR. So like, if I collect a bunch of data from the internet and someone asked me to delete like their data, like of course I would do that. I think there's still kind of these trade-offs in terms of how do you let people know that that's an option? How do you make sure that people are participating with consent? So, one thing, and this is another, so like, around, I don't even remember when this was, maybe 2011 or 2015, somewhere there, when all of the stuff on like Project Prism came out and these kind of huge bombshells from, I think, WikiLeaks, that was like, oh, the government is listening to everything everyone is saying around the world and yada, yada, yada. Initially, I felt like there were a ton of people who were super duper outraged about it. In some countries, like I think Germany officially was like, this is unacceptable, and we're going to start like enacting, some practices or legislature to try to like kind of curtail this and protect our citizens and so on. And then like a month later, nobody cared anymore. I was like, what? Like, people don't actually seem to mind that much. And I have no idea what to make of that, because to me, it's like whether or not somebody minds, that has not a whole lot of bearing on like the ethics of it, right? Because this is the thing, as we've moved deeper into computational space, as we can take old data and do things with it that we didn't even know we could do 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I can learn things, if I have like a diary entry that you wrote 10 years ago, the stuff I can learn about you from that same entry then versus now are just absolutely worlds apart. And so even if I give you data, I view language data as something that's so deeply connected to some of the kind of lowest levels of our psychology, really fundamental to who we are as people. If I give you that today and you're like, well, I'm just going to estimate how extroverted you are, that's great. 10 years from now, if you're like, I can figure out what your sexual orientation is, I can figure out, whether or not you have cancer, all kinds of stuff from that same data set. It's kind of like what the person didn't even know they were agreeing to that 10 years ago.
Uh-huh. Right. So on the bad end of this profiling, we have like people targeting you for ads or even surveillance in other countries, or maybe our own country too. But what about, let's close talking about the good aspects. Like, let's say we can build up very reliable profiles of what people are like based on whether that's their language or anything else we can gather. What good can we do with that?
That's a great question. And there are a lot of different answers. And this is one of the things I think we're just really starting to seriously ask some of these questions. So there are a lot of hand wavy responses like, oh, we'll be able to like help people get treatment who need it and stuff like that. But that's not exactly like a practical answer, right? It's just like someday things will get better and we'll be able to do that. I think that there are kind of a couple of directions. The one that I am most interested in is basically going the exact opposite direction of all of the kind of dark and spooky stuff that we talked about, which is give people greater self-knowledge. So if I can, I think about something like, and this may not be the best example, but something like 23andMe or like Ancestry. There are people who do the they get the like saliva swab, do at least a partial mapping of your genome using like SNP chipping or something like that. And then they say, okay, here's your heritage, you're 30% this, 20% that. You may be more prone to Crohn's disease than someone else or something like that. Imagine a world where all of that information is like super, super accurate, like 95 to 100% accurate. Having that information, being equipped with that information, gives you greater agency. It allows you to make an informed choice about what you want to do with your life and kind of what kind of outcomes you want for yourself. And if you have that information, then you are equipped with kind of better power to achieve whatever outcomes you want for yourself. So it's kind of a potentially more utopian view, is rather than kind of give everyone else that information about you and then use it to kind of control or manipulate you or try to get you to buy a new pair of shoes or something like that. What if you were equipped with that information and, something popped up that said like, you actually want a new pair of shoes. You didn't even know yet, but your back has been hurting. They're kind of old and smelly, and you're not going to get a date with that person at work because you got some nasty shoes, and this is what you really want. So here's the information. Here are the outcomes that you could achieve. Do with it what you will. Greater self-determination, I think, is one of the possibly positive outcomes that we can get from a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, that's a nice optimistic outlook on it. Ryan, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.